advocating for investing resources in campaigning for land value capture, land value tax. So maybe I'll just jump right into it. So I grew up in Vancouver and I moved back here in 2011, and I really noticed the giant jump even before then, kind of how land values were appreciating. And what sparked my interest in it was the way I think a lot of other people probably is have their interest sparked in something, which is a friend asked me a question after the 2008 real estate crash in the United States, which was global financial crisis. And it was another friend of theirs that said to them, hey, your parents should sell their house because this is going to happen here in Canada too. It's going to happen in Vancouver. And so he knows I'm interested in like economics and the history of economics, and so he's like, okay, well, what do you think? And I was in a really awkward position where I had to say, I don't know. I really don't understand the real estate market in BC and in Vancouver. And that made me really uncomfortable, and I was like, oh, I don't understand the real estate market, so I'm gonna go figure out what's going on. And when I dug into it, what I realized was that what was happening at the time was not a bubble. And there was this convention, I don't know if people from Vancouver remember at the time, there was this discussion that what we were seeing was a bubble, right? And this is like, so around 2009 to 2000, kind of 14, that kind of era. People were saying this is a bubble, it's gonna burst any second. And one of the things we realized is that this wasn't a bubble, it was worse than a bubble. And that the fundamentals of allowing this to continue were in place, and that there was no chance this was gonna burst anytime soon. And that was interesting to me, and so, I gave this friend, when I did that analysis, I gave this friend that advice, and I was like, hey, tell them not to sell their home. The land is going to appreciate. And what I learned from that is that what was happening in land prices was something that, it was something that has happened throughout the history of economics. In terms of it's really land is the method by which debt is secured between debtors and creditors. So I understood that one, this is what was happening, and two, that this was the largest transfer of wealth between the public and the private sector that BC had ever seen, that the province of British Columbia had ever seen. And that became really apparent. And the mechanism was by a few things. One is by over-lending on, or by rather putting significant credit spreads against land, and essentially baking in the financialization of that land, or baking in a compound debt obligation. Use of that land was essentially being taxed, or rather people's incomes were being taxed, tied to or secured against use of that land through the financialization of that land.
When you say land, you mean just the land component of any home?
Of any home, and also on the commercial side, yeah, for sure. So I think when we dug into it, we said, well, what's driving this? And basically at the time I got into this, I was executive vice president of my union. I was then elected the treasurer in 2014. It's a position I currently hold. And I had a whole bunch of members of my union coming up and saying, what's going on with the housing market? How come rents are going so high? And if you remember, rents are way higher than they were then. And back then it was considered a crisis. Back then people were like, this is a real problem, this is changing my quality of life, and now it's just completely out of control. And so we put together a pretty fulsome analysis of the union about what was going on, and we actually partnered with the union, one of the union, and it was the union that represents the workers of the BC Assessment Authority, because they're the people who do this assessment. They said they were similarly interested in this phenomenon. So we actually got together in 2017, we launched this Affordable BC campaign, and the flagship proposal in there was land value tax, basically a form of land value capture. And we actually put together kind of you can read the report on affordablebc.ca, but we put together this kind of almost like a menu rather than a meal of kind of options, of different policy options. Some of which were subsequently adopted. I'd say the low-hanging fruit was adopted, but the real key stuff we put together wasn't adopted. And some of the stuff that was adopted was adopted in such a way where it'd been like some parts of it were wholesale copy-pasted, so you could tell it was taken from this policy suite, but like some of the core measures necessary to make it effective were missing. They've been carved out. So what we realized was that by dramatically inflating the price of land, and by having a system where the regulation was in place to stop that dramatic inflation, is that it was impacting every sector of the economy in ways that they weren't able to consciously put together. So not only is it difficult to find a place to rent because of the baked-in financialization for the actual owners, right? Typically the owner is buying something on leverage. But when you look at the doctor shortages, nurses, skilled tradespeople, there's a very simple answer to this, is that in the economy we're in, if you can move to another jurisdiction, let's say you move south of the border of the United States, and you can be paid more, because the US dollar is quite a bit stronger. And there's very few times where Canada's petrodollar is floated up to that. So you can be paid more, and your cost of living is substantively less, then you're way better off. So we lose a lot of our skilled professionals in these areas because of this problem of land inflation. And so what we've seen is that the other problem is, and this is a major issue, is that your ability to compete on the global market economically in terms of your production goes down dramatically because the cost of labor here is so high. And so what's happened is we've been baked into this contradiction where on one hand you have elements of finance capital that have essentially assisted in bidding up in a relatively unregulated environment, bidding up the price of land to the point where wages have to be at a certain level in order to sustain those debt payments. It's essentially what they are. If you're paying if you pay a mortgage, you're paying a debt payment. If you pay rent, technically it's a debt payment, and it's a differently structured debt payment. Technically, you're saying, I am now in debt for this year's rent or the term of the lease or whatever, and I'm going to pay it off in these installments. So the actual technical instrument is it's a debt obligation. And if you look at that, wages can't come down, but there's this attempt to downward, you see this in an inflationary environment, there's pressure to push down wages. So we're kind of at the nexus of that, where, thankfully wages can't be pushed down, and in fact, in BC they've now tied the minimum wage to the BC Consumer Price Index. But we've got this contradiction going on. So I guess that's a pretty good intro into kind of how my union got involved and how I got involved in it, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, tell us about, so you've been championing, recently it seems like you had a journey from 2017 from land value tax to land value capture. Can you tell us a bit about your changing sort of views and advocacy for what's the system you were looking for, you wanted then, and what's the change you're looking for now?
What we're looking for right now is something that is two things. One, something that will materially improve people's quality of life here in Vancouver and British Columbia. And so we're looking for something that will generate enough revenue and income that we can build out affordable housing, we can subsidize some of this transit development, we can do these other things. We can subsidize some more inclusionary zoning, that kind of stuff. But that is small enough that we can actually get it in the near term. And small enough also that we can get it in and lock it in, so it can't be politically crushed. We can get a proof of concept in to show that this really works well. Have the benefactors receiving that benefit say, hey, we want to politically protect this and we don't want it to go away. So really where we kind of move to is we just need a version of this that is going to allow us to, I'll give a practical example. If we use the kind of the really good data and system set up in the BC Assessment Authority, and I'm not sure everyone knows this, but the BC Assessment Authority was intentionally set up in the 70s to eventually do land value tax. That was the whole point it was set up that way. That was a conscious part of setting it up that way. But if we get to a point where we make better use of the BC Assessment Authority, we allow the Assessment Authority, in fact, we promote and encourage them as a shared services provider to give advice to municipalities who typically don't have the internal capacity to do this. We take, we benchmark kind of the land values and increase. We already do that, and then the increases, but we take that benchmarking, and where we have substantive increases above the benchmark, we provide a secondary tax basis on which to fund transit, affordable housing, inclusionary zoning, these concepts. So we're not we're not very prescriptive about how that works. We think there's a few different avenues that work well, and there could be avenues that we haven't contemplated that would work better. But what we want to see is that this fundamental concept in place, because the other thing we want to see is we want to see land values get moderated and taken down a bit. And so one thing I want to address very, very clearly is that the single biggest political opposition we've seen to this is the absolute fear in political circles around land values dropping. And the idea that land values are securing someone's future retirement income. And I'm fortunate enough that I'm in a really good pension plan, so that's not the case. But a lot of people here don't have that pension above the Canada Pension Plan and old age security, and they're really worried about it. So but here's the thing, and here's the thing that kind of shows that's not true. We're in an environment right now where, because of inflation, interest rates have gone up and they've stayed up. And they've stayed up longer than some people thought they would. And so the hope of a lot of people in the real estate market right now who are looking to either jump in, or they're looking to enter the real estate market, or they're looking to change the residence they're in, their hope is actually that land values go down. Because their strategy, and this is pretty broad, it's probably most of the buyers in the market today, is to go into a place, basically have values drop, go into a place where as a result of values dropping, they're still paying the same if not a higher mortgage payment, but they're anticipating a future drop in interest rates, which means that when interest rates finally drop and they refinance their mortgage in 4 to 5 years, the principal that they've secured will have been fundamentally lower, or low enough that they'll feel like they'll have bought into the market at a lower rate. And so what they're betting on is being able to pay a higher compound interest debt obligation for that short period of time, 2 to 5 years, and then refinance or be in a variable rate where it comes down. And they'll actually have benefited from land prices going down. So I would challenge anyone that I believe a majority of buyers in this market actually are desirous of not a collapse in land values, but a downward moderation in land values. So there's a way to do this, and politically there's a way to do this. But yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Would you like to talk about your LVC transit proposal?
I think I could, but I think what would be better is just to, I think you can check affordablebc.ca. We want to basically, upzone, capture that value around those stations. But I think it'd be better, or transit hubs. But I think it'd be better just to maybe there's a lot of really knowledgeable people in there. I think it'd be better just to jump in a dialogue.
I just want to make sure people really see the thing that's really exciting about your work, and I don't think you really presented it. On one is the well, I should be presenting it for you, but the LVC around transit corridors. So right now there is right of development around transit corridors, and the latest work from the provincial government, but there's no land value capture.
Yeah.
So you're advocating for land value capture around transit corridors, and specifically through the abatement method you mentioned a few days ago. What would be your vision? Like how much an LVT, or what would be needed around transit corridors, and what would be the outcome of that?
Yeah, so there's a few ways to do this.
Yeah.
So we started advocating for this through municipalities. So we met with the mayors, we met with all the mayors in the Mayor's Council, we met with TransLink, we met with the provincial government, and we started doing this in 2017. And what we advocated for was, allowing better upzoning around these transit corridors in order to, so a couple things. One is, as we said, at the municipal level, you've got inclusionary zoning, but you can also bring in policy. So maybe I'll back it up a bit. At the municipal level, let's say you've got a major transit corridor. Well, municipalities have things called official community plans, OCPs. And what these OCPs do is they don't rezone property, but they land. I think you probably all know this, but it's probably for the benefit of viewers. They don't rezone land, but what they do is they say, down the road, we are going to rezone this land, or we are going to allow land to be upzoned to this level for these purposes, for this is the highest and best use of that land. But once an OCP is put in place, it's kind of as good as a rezoning almost, and so it actually inflates the values tremendously. So we actually see a lot of land values go up just with the OCP. And the thing that's really giving that land, or unlocking the potential value of that land, is the public infrastructure in various forms that have been built around it, right? Without public infrastructure, you can't unlock most of the value of that land. unless you're talking about a tree farm license or a mine, in which case it's mostly private industry. When we're talking about commercial residential, it's absolutely public infrastructure that's unlocking that value. And the issue we see is that those public tax dollars, that public infrastructure that's unlocking that value, is dispersed, right, into entropy, but there's no really efficient mechanism to capture a portion of that back. And so this is a solution to a number of problems that we have. So one problem is, there's a debate going on right now about how far do we extend the SkyTrain in either direction, right? And so one of the ways to solve that is if you capture part of the value that's created from the land uplift around that transit corridor, you can then cycle that back in an annualized taxation fashion to pay for that. And there's a mechanism by which you can already do this, which is the area benefiting tax, and that was written into legislation as a way of enabling this kind of activity. But that's not the only thing you can do. I mean, you can also, and this is something that we specifically advocated for, and in one sense we've actually had a successful implementation of this in Burnaby, is you can, when you put in an OCP, or even prior to an OCP, you can put in a policy that looks like this. You can say, this is the density, this is the floor space ratio or whatever of this land and the use case for this land. But we're willing to provide additional density if a percentage, but an iron law is that a percentage of that additional density must be for affordable housing to a certain standard. The standard we've picked is 80% of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation neighborhood rate. So CMHC maintains not city, but neighborhood charts, median neighborhood charts on affordability. So you say 80% of that is kind of your affordability lever. And you can say, look, okay, we'll give you an extra two FSR density on this land, but only under the condition that another 2 FSR is guaranteed inclusionary zone affordable housing under a municipal covenant in perpetuity for that to be the 80% of CMHC market median, right, is affordable housing. So that's actually something that we've implemented. That's happened. And I think that's a really good example of what you can do with that mechanism. So yeah, there's a few ways you can go, but the reason I'm keeping it open is that there's a lot of different ways to implement that, and I don't think we don't assume that we have the best way. We're just putting out what we think are actually, we know are incredibly effective policy options in order to address some of the key livability and affordability problems we're dealing with right now.
Amazing. Yeah, it's really exciting to think about that we could have massive expansion of infrastructure, of transit through land value capture. I remember reading a paper saying that the main reason for China's dramatic investments in infrastructure is, in a sense, indirectly because of land value capture, because of the land leasing system, and a lot of public wealth comes back to the government at the end of those leases, and that self-justifies more public transit, like more investments in infrastructure. So like imagine having a country where we actually have like a high-speed bullet train from coast to coast, financed through land value capture with no income tax dollars spent. Like I think that's possible. And like why don't we do that?